Hey everyone, today I want to share the next episode of the construction report on the Me-262 SCHWALBE. After I focused on the engine, today we are moving on to the paint job. First of all, as always, I would like to show you a few photos of the finished paint job. If you like it, I would be delighted if you subscribe. Just give it a thumbs up, and if you like, click the button below, and you are welcome to my channel. Before we can assemble the fuselage, we first need to sort out the gun bay. To do this, I studied a few reference images and realized that it was also available in various color schemes. I opted for a metallic finish and initially painted everything in a matte aluminium shade. I applied a black glaze to the machine guns so that some of the aluminium shade could still show through. The belt loading system was painted in a shade of gray. To enhance the gun bay components included in the original kit from Tamiya a little, I found a couple of decals from A-A2 in my collection and placed them on one or two of the boxes. You can either cut out the photo etched parts with nail scissors or simply use a craft knife. You may need to touch up a spot or two with a small file and then attach everything to the sub-assemblies using super glue. In some of the reference images I noticed quite a few cables and wires which you can simply add using copper or lead wire. However, at the scale of 1/48 it's a bit tricky to recreate very fine wires and cables. It is possible, but it's really hard to do this. So this time I've just hinted at them and then painted them in a shade of brown to add a bit of variety to the color scheme. Once you have finished all that, you can apply a wash with a bit of oil paint to create more depth. In this case I used raw umber and starship fills, or maybe black, just to enhance the depth of the gun bay. As there are a lot of cables behind the main instrument panel, and these are also visible through the cockpit canopy, I decided to recreate them using some lead wire as well. Lead wire has the advantage of being very easy to bend, but it can also be easily crushed with tweezers. Next time I would probably opt for copper wires instead, so I can work a bit more comfortably. Secure everything with super glue and tweezers, bend it into shape, and then paint everything in a color you like. In this case I used yellow. I had actually intended to use the complete Ares engine kit, but realized that this could easily have ended in a disaster, as I wasn't sure whether the fit was precise enough for the kit. So I decided to modify everything slightly, removing the engine nacelle from the original kit and adapting it to my own specifications. Quick Boost used a little different method and had a very nice kit in stock, but it is not available anymore at the moment. So I decided to change the original kit from Tamiya and to adapt it to my specifications. To do this, you need to mark the casing or the hull, the engine cover with a pencil so that you know where to cut out each part. Using a fine model saw, cut slightly along the actual edge and then shape it to the desired form using a sanding block. It is advisable to use some masking tape to avoid sanding away too much plastic. To fit the resin engine, you will need to sand the side walls down slightly and, if necessary, remove material with a craft knife. It is also important checking all the time if the engine fits easily into the opening, and if necessary, use additional resin parts to replicate the engine mount. To use the Ares engine, however, you will need to trim it down slightly. This way you won't have to adjust the rear section as well, and there is no different look in between the left and the right engine because the original Tamiya parts are used for both engine sides. Before we can move on with the actual painting job or the paint work, we still need to mask off the cockpit canopy and trace out a few rivet lines. To do this, you can use masking tape, stick it onto the cockpit canopy and carefully trim the edges with a new craft knife blade. If you find it that too fiddly, you can of course use or buy masking film specifically designed for the Me-262 from a model shop. You can trace the rivets and the panel lines using a scriber or an engraving needle. To avoid damaging too much material with the scriber, you should buy some special scribing tape so that you can draw nice straight lines. I used scribing tape from AK. It's a wonderful tape, easy to use. It's not expensive, quite cheap, and it's highly recommended to use this. This brings us to the main focus of the video, the paintwork. To provide a good base for the paint and to even out any minor imperfections, I painted the model with a grey primer. Unlike the original black primer, I deliberately choose grey here because, in my opinion, the shadow effects with black often look too strong. Once we have finished applying the primer, we can move on to the pre-shading. This time I've decided not to necessarily use black as a shading color. In my view, black tends to become too dominant in the final result. So I decided to use a light blue-gray shade and applied it with a 0.2 airbrush with thin coat of paint over each rivet line or maybe prominent point that should be a little bit darker or should have some shades and shadows. It is not necessarily the case that you need to be precise in your work. I also thought at the beginning that the lines had to be straight. I was afraid that it wouldn't look good, but looking back, I say you really don't have to draw lines or straight lines at all. What is important is that you work in multiple layers. In this way, you can model the effect bit by bit and achieve depth. What is important in this regard is that you think about where shadows might appear and which areas will appear darker. The underside of the aircraft can be made significantly darker than top. Once everything has dried thoroughly, you can start applying the actual paint. In this case, I used AK recolors. It's easy to work with, high quality and paramount finish. It is important that you apply the color in a really even and consistent manner. Let the shading still show through slightly and consider how strong the effect should be. After giving it a lot of thoughts, I decided not to apply the camouflage pattern freehand. So I choose making a stencil out of masking tape instead. I simply took a stripe of masking tape and cut out a desired shape freehand using a cutter knife. Attach the finished stencil to the fuselage and you are ready to start applying the first coat of paint for the camouflage pattern. It is important to work in circular sweeping motions to create a bit of contrast. Once you have applied the green base color, you can move on to the darker shade, in this case brown. To do this, mask off the relevant areas with masking tape and apply the paint to the model in a very diluted state using circular motions. Once everything has dried thoroughly, you can begin post-shading the individual color areas. To do this, it's best to mix a light sandy shade with the base color. It is important to set aside a little paint for later work. I've decided to mix 3 different color variations for each shade. To do this, simply add a little more sandy tone to the respective color. It is important, however, not to overdo it, otherwise it will very quickly look unrealistic. It is better to work in small increments. You then apply the lighter shade in thin layers from the inner side of individual panels or areas, deliberately leaving the outer edges or areas that are meant to be darker uncovered. To create even more impact and depth to the model, you can mask off individual areas with masking tape to create sharper edges. This makes the camouflage pattern appear even more three-dimensional. Check after each step to see if you are happy with the result, and always bear in mind that further weathering steps will tone down the effect slightly later on. Once we have finished that, you should coat the previous paintwork with a glossy clear varnish and leave it to dry for a good 24 hours. After that, we can start applying the decals. To do this, cut the decals out of the sheet using a cutter knife, soak them in warm water and then apply them to the model. You should coat the areas where you want to place the decals with a decal setting solution to achieve a smooth finish at the end. To apply the decals flush with the surface, take a cotton bud and roll the excess water or liquid outwards. Finally, apply a little more decal setting solution on top, and after leaving it to dry for a few hours, apply another coat of glossy clear varnish. The reason for this is that subsequent panel line washes will flow better if you have applied a glossy coat of paint. With a matte clear coat, the paint literally bites into the clear coat, and this can quickly lead to unsightly edges. Once everything is dried thoroughly for a good 24 hours, you can start the overall global wash. For the top side, I use the dark gray-brown shade. For the underside, I use the dark blue-gray panel liner or oil paint. You may need to apply several coats of different panel liner shades to some areas to achieve the desired effect. Once everything is dried to touch or thoroughly, take a piece of kitchen roll and carefully wipe away the excess paint. As already mentioned, it may be necessary to apply several layers of paint in certain areas to create sufficient depth. In some places, I even decided to use a black panel liner to create more depth. However, black should only be used sparingly, as it can quickly lead to look too harsh. To create even more depth, I then decided to lighten individual panels further with oil paints to give them more readiness. To highlight areas where the paint has chipped off or is highly or heavily worn, I used a very light shade of brown and green acrylic paint and applied it sparingly using a drying retarder and a 5-0 brush. This requires a lot of patience and practice and should really only be done in specific areas. Depending on the degree of wear, you can use this technique to create either a heavily worn look or a brand new model. All in all, it took me a good 3 months to get to this stage of the build. I think the result is something to be proud of, and that's all for today, folks. If you would like, please leave me a comment. I would also be delighted if you subscribe. Until then, have fun and happy modeling.